Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome everybody to my Revolutionize Your Retirement Interview with Expert series. I'm Dorian Mintzer, owner and president of Revolutionize Retirement, and I'm your host for the call. So I am really delighted today to introduce Dr. Harry R. Moody, known as Rick Moody, and we're going to be discussing dreams for the second half of life. Just to put a little bit in context, I first met Rick in 2007 at the first Positive Aging Conference, which was in St. Petersburg. And before this call is done, he's going to tell us about an upcoming one that's going to be at the end of August in Washington. Rick is former Vice President and Director of Academic Affairs with the RP, and he's a prolific author, speaker, and advocate for positive aging. Many of you on the call know him, and hopefully some of you will have an opportunity to get to know him. He does, and he'll be telling us about some of the dream workshops that he does, and he has 3 books, it sounds like, that are pending. He's also he's author of over 100 scholarly articles as well as many books, and one of the books is The 5 Stages of the Soul, and it's translated into 7 languages worldwide. He also has written a book called Aging Concepts and Controversies, and he just was telling me earlier that he's in the process of editing the 9th edition. I've been using that book since the 5th edition, and so I'm currently using the 8th edition for a gerontology course that I teach, and it's really an excellent book. I recommend it to people because it's got if you're teaching, it's got an instructor site with all kinds of wonderful resources, and it has a student site, so they're great resources for the students too. So anyway, I'm going to get this started because there's just so much that we can do in the period of time that we have. So I do encourage, please, everybody send in your comments and questions as we go along so I can integrate that in. But let's start, Rick, if you could just talk a little of just how you got interested in aging and midlife and aging dreams. I just wanted to start with that.
First of all, let me thank you for that great introduction. Listening to all these things that I'm doing, I realized maybe I need to be retired. And then all of a sudden I realized, hey, wait a minute, I am retired. And I did retire a couple of years ago from AARP, but of course I'm busy doing other things. And I got interested in the aging work actually 45 years ago. I'm 71 now. I was a graduate student at Columbia, and I started teaching in senior centers around New York City, and I realized that older folks were actually the best students, best customers, you might say, for philosophy. And I've always held that view, and later on got involved with Elder Hostel, now Rhodes Scholar. And I think it's absolutely the case. I guess the challenge for our culture is for people to really take on the idea that later life is a time of growth and positive development. So that's my story.
Thank you. So what about dreams? Do we all dream? I know that's a basic question. I'm not sure everybody who's on the call really is interested in dreams. Hopefully they are, but maybe not. So I wanted to just start with the basics. What is it about dreams? Do we all dream?
In fact, all warm-blooded creatures, mammals as well as birds, do dream. And for reasons that science doesn't understand, dreams somehow are important to us. But not everybody remembers their dreams. And my message to our listeners is you don't have to, and you don't have to be interested in dreams. The dreams do their work just as your liver does its work. But for people who are interested in self-knowledge, you might say, dreams can be a very useful tool, a channel, a window. And there's a Talmudic saying, actually, that I like. A dream uninterpreted is like a letter unopened. We all get junk mail, it's true. But if you just throw away your mail without opening it, you might be making a mistake. But yeah, I think dreams do have great potential for all kinds of reasons, and that's what we're going to be talking about.
Great. Are there ways that people can help themselves remember their dreams?
Yes. The most important is by listening to this broadcast and thinking about it. And I suspect some people tonight will have dreams that they'll remember just because of the intention. Intention is everything in so many aspects of life. So if you want to remember your dreams, you can intend to do that. You can keep a notebook by your bedside. You can write down your dreams. And if you're really interested, keep a kind of a dream journal, and you'll discover interesting things. Even years later, you may see things in a dream that you didn't realize at the time. So, yeah, there are things that you can do if you want to, but you don't need need to. As I say, the dreams take care of themselves, and very often people will have a powerful dream that will press itself on you, and that makes itself known and says, pay attention to me.
Like a wake-up call, I would assume.
Yeah, like a wake-up call where you continue to sleep.
Yeah. Through the research you've done about dreams, do dreams change as we age? Are they different based on where we are in the kind of developmental life cycle?
The answer is yes and no, in the sense that there are physical and psychological tendencies. For example, sleep patterns do change as we grow older, so the boundary between sleep and waking may become different. Infants and young children have a larger space of their night to dream. But there's a great saying from the Hebrew Bible: your young shall see visions, and your old ones shall dream dreams. And I think that what the Bible is telling us there is that there is an importance both to our visionary work, the kind of thing that my 29-year-old son is doing and looking forward to his life and remaking the world and all that, and also to the dreams that I have as someone who's 71 years old and somebody who might be 81 or 91. So the dreams that we have at different stages of our life, midlife, aging, and so forth, will reflect things that are important to us in those years. Retirement, chronic illness, relationships, and especially in later life, processing the past. I had lunch yesterday with a 79-year-old friend of mine, and he'd never heard of the idea of life review. But in fact, he was doing it in his dreams. He was revisiting earlier events in his life, his relationship with his mother, all kinds of things like this. And so I use that term life review because it's a term that was invented by a very great man, Robert Butler, who was a psychiatrist, the founder of the National Institute on Aging. I had the great good fortune to work for Robert Butler and get to know him personally. And many years ago, more than 50 years ago, Bob was a psychiatrist, and he wrote an article about reminiscence and what he called the importance, the value of reminiscence for what he called life review. And I think that I would extend that by saying it's not just a matter of writing your memoirs or autobiography or family history, all important things, good things, but sometimes we engage in life review in our dreams, even if we don't know that it's life review. And that's what my 79-year-old friend yesterday, he was amused to hear that it's like that saying in Moliere, there's a character in one of his plays where the character says, "What? You mean I've been speaking prose all my life?" And you can speak prose and you can dream dreams that are life review. This is something to take account of, and that's why I'm glad we're having this conversation today.
Well, and you say in your articles, and it's just true in terms of development, that we certainly have this conscious self, but the dreams really are these inroads into what's underneath, and sometimes the shadows or the dark side. But I like particularly that you talk about it's discovering something new, but it's not really discovering something new in the second half of life. Can you talk about that, of the discovery versus creation, I guess?
Dreams in general show us what we already know. There are dreams. Dreams enable us to know what we glimpse or see, but we don't understand. Dream work can be a way of people getting acquainted with, let's call it the unconscious. And it's a curious thing. We're living in a culture that it's more than 100 years since Freud wrote his book, The Interpretation of Dreams. Supposedly, we're living in a very psychological culture, blah, blah, blah. But I am struck by the extent to which people in our world really do not believe in the unconscious. They really do not recognize how much of us is unknown. We know it in physics because astrophysics tells us that, more than 90% of the universe is dark matter and dark energy. What we see, the visible cosmos, is only a very small part of what's out there. And what's out there shapes the visible world that we see. I'm talking about astronomy now, which happens to be one of my interests. The same is true for the inner world, the microcosm, the self. There is much, much more to us than we have any idea. And now the physicists accept the notion of dark matter because we've proven it empirically. But guess what? We've proven it empirically with regard to psychosomatic illnesses, the whole field of psychoneuroimmunology, mind-body medicine. We're now opening this up. Even conventional mainstream medicine is recognizing it, but we often are reluctant to see it about ourselves, particularly, and I have to say this as a guy who has a PhD in philosophy, rationalists, people we identify ourselves with our rational waking self, and that's who we are, and we make decisions. Well, maybe not. And maybe we need to learn to see other aspects of ourselves. Now, you mentioned about the second half of life. We happen to live in a culture that really doesn't have much use for aging. I don't need to belabor that point to our listeners. So we'll try everything possible, and I'm not just talking about Botox or plastic surgery, but people will say, for example, when I retired a couple of years ago, a very prominent person, I won't tell you his name, authority said to me, he said, Rick, you're too young to be retired. Now, I was 69 or 70 years old at the time, but I'm too young to be retired, maybe because what we value in our culture is activity and achievement and looking young and all of that sort of thing, and I'm no different from anybody else. I think I told the story of I was with my wife and I, we were on a Rhodes Scholar trip and with two Japanese American women, and I mentioned one of them. I said, well, I'm 70 years old, and she said, really? She said, you don't look like you're 70. And for a moment, I was thrilled, of course. Wow. And then she said, but then again, Caucasians never do look their age. So she gave with one hand and took away with the other. But my point of that story is that all of us, including me, want to think of themselves as younger than we actually are, and our dreams sometimes can give us a different message. Not a gloomy message, but a message that says, wait a minute, you really are a certain age, or you really do have a certain illness, or you really do have a certain thing in your relationship to people. That's a message that we need to hear, but maybe we don't hear consciously. So that's why dreams are important for aging, because aging, just like dream work itself, is part of the vast shadow element of our culture, something that we don't really want to look at, we don't really want to take seriously, but we need to.
So you don't think we always are young in our dreams?
No, we're not always young in our dreams. Sometimes we often are. People do have dreams in which they are their younger self, and that's a very important message too.
Right.
But sometimes they have dreams in which they are, either they or a figure in the dream is an elder, maybe the wise old woman or the elder man or whatever it may be. So I think we are different ages in our dreams, and those images mean different things.
And we'll get into more of that, because I know in another article I read, there's some interesting issues about the elder ego and the elder ideal, and
yes,
I want to get into that. But so how does, in one of your articles, you talk about the relationship of life planning to dreaming. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, I think life planning is a very good thing, and so is retirement planning, so is financial planning, and I've been involved with all of those fields, and I'm a member of the Life Planning Network, and I'm very happy to say, are one of the sponsors of our National Positive Aging Conference, which is going to be held in Washington, D.C. next August. And if any of our listeners are interested, they can send me a message. I'll be glad to let them know more details. But life planning is a good thing, but often people, when they think about life planning, they have a very rational approach to it. They say, how much money do I have for retirement? What's my 401k plan? Where will I live? Where are the grandchildren, and so forth? And I was once with a woman in Asheville, North Carolina, and she told me a dream that she'd had. She and her husband they were great planners. They planned everything in life. And there's people like that. My brother-in-law is one of those people. You start planning for old age when you're 40 kind of thing. There are other people who don't plan at all for anything. They just wing it, which are these different types. She and her husband were planners, and so they decided they were going to move to Hilton Head Island in South Carolina, excuse me. I actually had a timeshare in South Carolina, Hilton Head, so I know the area very well. And they did everything right. They paid for it. They got just the right house, the golf nearby, all the rest of the stuff. And then 6 months after they'd moved in, after preparing for 10 years for this, she had the dream in which she was in the dream, she was at her high school reunion. In other words, she was her younger self. And she was panicked because she couldn't find a ride home. There was nobody. She was stranded there at the reunion. People were leaving. And how was she going to get home? And when she woke up, she immediately understood what the dream was telling her. The dream was telling her she was in the wrong place. She was stranded. Hilton Head Island, for those of you who've never been there, it's a beautiful planned place. It's one of the most beautiful places in North America. It's a wonderful place, but not for everybody, and not for her, and not for her and her husband. And she realized that what the dream was telling her was they'd made the wrong choice. They'd moved to the wrong place. So based on that and some further reflection and processing, of course, they sold their house. She moved to Asheville, North Carolina, where she joined the Center on Creative Retirement there, which is a wonderful program, incidentally. Been around a number of years now. And when I met her at actually a social gathering, she couldn't have been happier living in Asheville, North Carolina. She made the right choice, and it was a dream that gave her the guidance. So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is, by all means, engage in rational planning, life planning, prepare for it, figure out your 401k, all the rest of it. But also pay attention to the parts in yourself which are not conscious, whether it's a dream or whether it's feelings, if you're uneasy or whatever, your body language, all these kind of things that are important. And you may learn important things there.
And you also talk about, I'm just resonating what you were just saying, but it's tied into, I think, that image you use about dreams being like the GPS into our authentic self or our true selves. Can you elaborate on that? Because I really like that concept.
Analogy. GPS is a great tool. I use it. We need it in our car. Avoids getting lost. A GPS can tell us where we are, can give us a reading, a message from the unseen world of electromagnetic signals from satellites and all the rest of it. But a GPS doesn't tell us where we want to go. It doesn't tell us where we need to go. We have to plug that in. We have to put in the address. It's not automatic. And that's true for dreams, too. Dreams, as in the case of this one that I just mentioned, and we could give other examples, they give us a glimpse of where we're at that we did not know and that we could not know any other way, like a GPS would. So in that sense, we're no longer lost. At the same time, it offers us a challenge. Where do we want to go? Your series is called Revolutionizing Retirement. We do need to revolutionize retirement. It's not going to be the same in 2016 as it was 30 or 40 years ago, or as it was for my parents, for example, World War II generation. So things are changing, and yet we don't have a map of what the future of retirement could look like or should look like for me, for you, for every individual. Mm-hmm. And that's why dream work is so important, because you can get good advice about life planning, about financial planning, about retirement planning, and it's all worthwhile. Read the books, get the information, but then at the end of the day, it really depends upon you and where you are at in your life as an individual. And that process, which Carl Jung called individuation, really means becoming the person you were meant to be. And that is possible for people in later life, and dreams can be part of that.
Great. I want to integrate a question from one of the listeners right now, and then we'll continue with that too. But Bill from Cambridge says there's a lot of buzz in the tech world about wearable devices like iWatches that can monitor our moods. Is that misdirected rationalism, or will emerging new technologies help us to connect to the unconscious? If so, do you think they will someday act as an inner GPS to help prevent making wrong decisions like moving to Hilton Head instead of Asheville?
I'm all in favor of, I don't have a wearable device myself, but I've used them in the past in terms of step counters and things like that. And I've also been involved with blood sugar monitoring and things of that sort. And I think that this whole field is relatively new. It's going to be important because it's going to give insight at the biomedical level about what's going on in real time, in real life, as opposed to what happens in doctors' offices. So that's all a good thing. Will it solve all our problems of life? Probably not, any more than GPS tells us where to go. But it can give us clues, can give us insights. Irony here is that we already have, because of the result of billions of years of evolution, we have something in us which is able to monitor things at a deep, deep level while we're sleeping and while we're waking, and that is our dream life. So we've been given a kind of wearable monitoring device through our brain, but we are not often don't pay attention to it. It's as if we had a kind of a wearable device, but we left it in the drawer because we said, oh, this is too complicated, or I can't figure out how to make it work. There might be ways to listen better to that wearable monitor, and that's what dream work can be. But in terms of technology, I think a lot of insights are going to come from the application of technology to the wider world, and that's a good thing.
That's very interesting to just think about, that we really do have that internal GPS inside that we don't listen to. So that relates to my next question, which is, what are ways to listen to it more? How do we use dreams to help us be the person we were meant to be? I was wondering if you could comment on that and maybe share, it was the dream of, I think it was Marie, that somehow spoke about that a little bit, but let me just ask it in general to start with.
I've already given some clues about this when I talk about the importance of intention and taking the unconscious seriously, and if people want to pursue it, to write down their dreams, to keep track of them, and all of that. So all that's a good thing. I think that there's no magic to this, and the attempt to think that you can sort of short-circuit it by, for example, buying a dream dictionary. This is something which is, these devices, dream dictionaries, have existed forever, since antiquity. They were in Rome, they were very popular, dream dictionaries, and they have been popular in all cultures of the world. Why are they popular? Because people, number one, need guidance, but the mistake I think they make is to think that if I have a dream about a fish, it means this. If I have a dream about flying, it means that. This is not, dream dictionaries will always be popular because people are looking for simple, quick answers. But the truth of the matter is that our dream life is symbolic. And a symbol is different from a sign. A sign is like maybe a word or something that could be incorporated into a dictionary. There's a simple translation. Translating dreams or interpreting dreams is much deeper and much more individual and much more a matter of our own individual freedom. For example, I'll give you an example of a retirement dream that was my own dream that happened to me, and it's a very short dream, but an important one, maybe 6 months before I retired from AARP. And in my dream, I was on a bus, and I couldn't see the driver, but I knew that there was a driver. I was the only person on the bus. No one else was on the bus. And all the windows were blanked out, were blocked, they were covered with black, so that it was impossible for me to see where the bus was going. But then at a certain point, the bus stopped, and the driver made clear to me that I was to get out, and I did get out. And what did I do? I took my bicycle off the front of the bus. Here in Boulder, Colorado, where I live and where I am right now, we're a very big town on bicycles, like Portland, Oregon. And so you can put your bicycle, I've done this actually in real life, on the front of a bus, and it'll take you along, and then at a certain point, time to get off, you ride the bicycle again. That's what happened in my dream. And as I awoke and as I thought about the dream, I realized that this was actually a message to me about my retirement, that I was being driven along. I couldn't see out of the windows. I couldn't see where I was in my life, really, but I knew that somebody else was in charge. Now, who was that driver? Every detail in a dream is important. So the fact that it was a bus, there was nobody else in the bus. I was alone. So in a certain sense, part of the message of that dream is that I'm not in a collection of people and we're all retiring, we're all going through the process the same way. No, each of us is going through things alone in a certain radical way, and yet there is some element in us, the driver, let's call it, that at the right time will stop the bus and indicate it's time to get off. And what do I do when I get off the bus? I get onto a bicycle and ride under my own power. That also is a metaphor about what retirement could be. And as I thought about this dream, I realized that it wasn't just my dream. It was a collective dream, in the sense that the world that we're living in now is a very different world than the world that my dad lived in. My dad retired when he was 65 years old, very predictable, 1985, moved to Florida. He was on a sort of a trajectory, a script. He was not revolutionizing retirement. He did some things that were very distinctive. For example, he took courses at Central Florida University, so many courses that he ended up on the front page of the Orlando Sentinel as having taken more courses than any senior citizen in history, which was typical for him, because even though he was a businessman, he was also a kind of a private intellectual, and he transmitted some of that to me. But he also did something else in Orlando. He got a job at Disney World, helping find lost children. And I realized as I thought about that in a way, when I was growing up, he didn't have a lot of time. He was too busy with his job and all the rest. And he was living out part of his relationship to children and younger generation. So there were elements in his life in which he was living the unlived life in him in his retirement. That was the inner world. But the outer world, he did something very conventional. 65, retire, move to Florida. What could be more conventional? That was not my dream. My dream is telling me, and I think telling all of us, that we need to do what Dorian Mintzer is telling us to do, namely revolutionize retirement. And it's going to take different forms for different people because we can't count on the forms that were characteristic, for example, a defined benefit pension program. Just to cite on the financial side, that's mostly gone away. There's still a few left for government employees, but mostly it's gone away. People are more and more on their own. And that's what the dream was telling me. The bus comes to a halt. Didn't know where I was going. I was brought along, but then at that point, I had to get on the bicycle and power under my own muscle power. I'm on my own. Not just me, but everybody. And that's what makes this a very challenging time in which we're living. And I think why this show that you do, Revolutionize Retirement, is so very important, because people have to figure out where they're going to go. And as with the GPS analogy, we don't have a map. In a way, if you go to college, you have a kind of a map which says, okay, after I've gone to college, it's time for me to get a job, or maybe you get married, or whatever it is. We have a kind of a script, in a sense, it's not a very solid script. It's not exact. It's not universal. It's much different than it was 50 years ago. But there is a kind of a script for adulthood. We have no script at all for old age, for later life. You're completely on your own, and that's why riding that bicycle is a message, not just for me. It's not just my dream. I think it's a message for all of us. Sorry for going on at great length, but
No, I'm glad you did. I think you're so right. It helps to think about how in now the 21st century, we're all struggling both consciously and unconsciously with this shifting paradigm about aging. Because aging really has for so long still, many people view it just as decline and decrepit and giving up and loss. Your dream is just a wonderful example that you could get off and ride the bike and still be vital and autonomous. And that's what I think, that's the new paradigm of trying to be as autonomous as we can be. So it's a great example.
It's a great dream of a woman, and a young woman who in her dream, she encounters an old woman, very old woman, who has an elaborate wardrobe of clothes. And the young woman thinks, maybe I could have some of these clothes. And the old woman is reluctant to give them to her because the old woman feels, I'm not sure that you'll know how to use them. And then the young woman wakes up. This is a dream in a way about the image of old age. The old woman is the young woman grown old who has certain clothes, who has certain roles, who has certain possibilities. But will the young woman be able to use those clothes when she grows old? Or will she turn away and say, no, I'm not really old, I can't, whatever it may be? That's a very powerful message, and it's not a message to a person who was old, like I am right now, but a person who was young, but anticipating growing older. And that's why, in a sense, we have to, in a way, be role models for other people, those of us who are elders. That's one of the things that inspired me in the work that I did for many years with Elder Hostel, now called Road Scholar, by the way. And that is a program which, when it started in 1975, was really a revolutionary idea, saying you're not too old to go back to college and learn things. And we're much more accepting of that today. Everybody is happy. Oh, yeah, I went on a Road Scholar trip and so forth. That's a good thing, and we need to always open up these possibilities. And that's, I think, what you're doing, Dory, with Revolutionize Retirement.
Thank you. Makes me think, too, in your writing you talk about the kind of persona that we develop in that first half of life, the working, there is more of a map of knowing what we're supposed to achieve and do. And part of what you've talked about, and maybe you can expand on here, is that dreams help us, in a sense, take that mask off to find what's the real person inside rather than just the outer self that we present to the world, the roles, as you were saying.
Yes, it's very true. And sometimes people, and I've given some examples in my writing, of people who actually will have a dream about themselves wearing a mask, or one dream that I remember of a baby, a woman who had a dream about her baby, and the baby has a gold mask on, and the dreamer doesn't really know what to make of that. In ancient Greek times, when people performed plays, everybody wore a mask, and that was how Sophocles, Euripides, people like that, they wrote plays, people would perform with masks. We do that today, but we don't do that in the theater. We do that in real life. We learn to put on masks, and we have to be the mother. We have to be the partner. We have to be the professor. We have to take on those roles. It's possible for people in later life to begin to drop the role, or at least separate themselves from the role, or realize that maybe the role that they had held for so long is not a role that they want to carry on anymore. And our dreams can sometimes give us messages like this, the golden mask. It's not easy to drop roles because sometimes they become habitual and they become sources of ego strength. And one of the great problems in later life is that people lose that image to others. This is particularly true for older women. I'm told by older women that people look past them, that they don't pay attention, that they ignore them. And I think it's slightly different for women than for men because of the prominence of physical appearance. But for all of us, men and women, later life is a time in which we are fated to no longer be what we have been. And this is why dreaming and aging too becomes a challenge. Who are we now? Who am I if I'm just the former vice president of AARP, or if I was a former physician? I have a good friend who's a doctor who retired a couple of years ago, and he really tried very hard to retire, but he really couldn't do it. And so he's now gone back to working part-time in a hospice program, and he's much happier as a result. There are other cases where physicians, and I think this is going to be particularly true for somebody like a physician or a policeman or whatever, they become very wedded to their role, and they become lonely if they don't have a context in which they can be with others. So that's not something that's limited to dreams or to psychology. That's a big problem for our society. Fortunately, we got a lot of older folks, aging boomers, who are tuned into Facebook or whatever. They're finding ways to connect. And I think that this is going well beyond the dream question, but I think that importance of connection is exceedingly important.
Positive psychology certainly says it's connection, engagement, and purpose and meaning. That's just kind of the three legs of well-being, and I think it's so true at whatever age, but particularly as we get older. I have a couple more questions here from listeners that I want to integrate, and then some other questions of my own. But so Loretta from Denver says, my mom turns 95 on Thursday and recently relocated to a senior living community following a fall. It seems that talking through her dreams with her could help us understand how her adjustment is going. Do you agree?
I agree completely. And tell Loretta from Denver to send me a message, because I host a regular positive aging lunch group in Denver and Boulder, where I live, and I'm more than happy to put her on the list, because it's one way of connecting with people. This is not for people in senior living facilities, although we have a couple. It's for people who are artists, who are psychotherapists, who are involved in work or activities somehow related to positive aging. But the transition to a senior living facility, and I'm very familiar with them. I've been to many. I'm even signed up to move into one someday, perhaps. That is, like any transition, can provoke lots of challenges and anxieties, and people sometimes speak about it openly. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they are just unhappy. Sometimes they're very happy. It isn't always that they're unhappy when they move. There are many cases of people who couldn't be happier because they are connected with other people and less lonely. So whatever path is, by all means, pay attention to the dreams. Thank you, Loretta.
So when one other comment, really not a question, but can be a segue of me mentioning what next month is too, but Rebecca from Maryland says that art has helped her to better care for herself and her loved ones and to access her creative persona. And she said some might be interested in this free resource, Creative Caregiving Guide from the National Center for Creative Aging, which is creativecaregiving.creativeaging.org. And that leads me to before you respond, Rick, Greg Finch from the National Center for Creative Aging is going to be my guest next month and talking about this creative caregiving. So I'm hoping people will want to be part of that. And there is a conference coming up in September, also in Washington, sponsored by the National Center for Creative Aging. So just wanted to mention that. But did you want to comment at all?
I'm a huge admirer of the National Center for Creative Aging. I had the great good fortune to know Gene Cohn personally. He was our very first keynote speaker at the first National Positive Aging Conference. And I now know that Gay Hanna has stepped down as director of the National Center on Creative Aging, but the program is going to continue to flourish. They have done enormously great work, and we've now seen a lot more interest in music, for example, as well as the visual arts, which are all forms of healing that for people in the widest sense of the word. I don't just mean for people who are sick. That's therapy. That's valid too. But even those of us who are not sick, so to speak, I don't personally have any health problems. But this year, in the next month or two, I'm taking 2 week-long programs, one on contemplative photography here in Boulder and one on mime. And I'm going to learn to become a mime artist. I've been a public speaker much of my life, but that's using my mouth, what I'm doing right now. I want to learn to use my body as an artistic vehicle. So I think all of us, wherever we are in life, need to open up to these possibilities of the arts. And actually, that's very close to dreams.
Right, very interconnected. So can you talk a little more about sort of the notion of the ego, the elder ego and the elder ideal? Because I know a lot of this emerges in dream work, and maybe you could explain that a little.
Yes, I'm thinking of a dream of a prominent physician who, this is when he was in midlife, but he was watching a pool of water, and out of the pool of water, gradually an old man rose higher and higher, coming out of the water and standing above the leaves and all the rest of it, and he watched this figure, he realized that this was a man who was very old, but also very vigorous. And when he woke up, he realized that this was an image of his own possible later self, what I would call the elder ideal, which is very different from, which can also be valid, an image of oneself as frail or weak or vulnerable. Both can be true, because both can be possibilities for us. But particularly in our culture, where we tend to associate age invariably with weakness and loss, we need to pay attention to those cases where, as in this case of the physician who had this dream of the elder ideal, that man in the dream was below the level of the water. It was underwater. It was invisible. And sometimes when we have dreams of things that are underwater or below the depths, they are really images of the depth in ourselves, or the ocean of the unconscious. But that figure was emerging from the ocean of the unconscious and casting aside those leaves and so forth to really be this vigorous, powerful self. This is a possibility to be powerful but also old. And that kind of duality is something that we need to take seriously. I think that there have been some wonderful work, by the way, in photography of old faces that are distinctively old, that is wrinkled, but are also beautiful. And that's an interesting combination that we don't see enough of, partly because our culture, going back to the Greeks, inherits kind of an image of a health and beauty with youth, which is completely without blemishes, without wrinkles. Think of Greek statues that you see. There are some rare examples of Greek statues of the wrinkled old woman, for example, but they're unusual. And that tradition of art that comes down to us from ancient Greece then reappears in the Renaissance and appears even more so in contemporary advertising. This really reinforces a very one-sided view of life, a very one-sided view of aging. And one of the things that we try to do in this positive aging work, whether in my little lunch groups or the national conferences or the newsletter that I do on this subject, is to open up other possibilities, because our culture generally doesn't do that, and we need to do that. And that's what you're doing with Revolutionizing Retirement.
I'm certainly trying to. And that leads to Bill's question, again from Cambridge. He just wonders if you might know, Rick, is there a positive aging lunch group or its equivalent in Greater Boston? He says there's a group in Cambridge called Forever Creative, which hosts a weekly art group to make memory maps, but it's more about looking backwards rather than looking forward.
I love the idea of memory maps. Dory, you live in the Boston area, and you're in a much better position to answer this question than I am. There is a group like this in Philadelphia and in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley, and there are undoubtedly other groups like this around there. I know there are because they're associated with Jing International, which was an enterprise that Reb Zalman Schachter established. So yes, there are a number of groups around this country, and for people who are interested in this, I would recommend that, and I think you were going to say this anyway, Dory, if people send me a message, I'll be glad to send them a sample copy of the newsletter that I do, Human Values in Aging, which I send only to my 10,000 closest friends every month. But I only put on the list people who actually write to me and say, I want to get this newsletter. And one of the things that I do in the newsletter is to publicize events, conferences, workshops, any activities that relate to positive aging, let's call it, in the broadest sense of the term. Very broad. I'm very broad about this. But I'm not dealing with things that are primarily about how to make your will or home care provision. All of those are important things. They're good things. But I try to emphasize the positive. So just send me a message at hrmoody@yahoo.com, and I'll be glad to send you a sample copy of the newsletter.
And I'll make sure that when the recording goes out that Rick's email is part of that so people will know how to reach him. But also I did want to comment, Bill, that you can send me an email too at Dorian@DorianMintzer.com. There are local things in the Boston area. There is the Positive Aging Network, although it's not a lunch group, but also tied in with what Rick was saying about the Saging group. Saging International is a wonderful organization. It also has a conference coming up in October. But there are what's called wisdom circles, and I'm a member of one. There are a couple of wisdom circles that developed out of the Life Planning Network, a combination of Life Planning Network and Saging, because some of the members of the wisdom circle are members of both. And I would say that we talk backwards and forwards, so that it's just really talking about what it's like growing older. And it's a wonderful way. And they're models for people developing their own wisdom circles. And I'm happy to share that information with you, Bill, if you want to be in touch. And there are these wisdom circles around the country. And through going to Saging International, I think they're actually bringing it up to date of letting people know where there are wisdom circles or, again, how to develop your own. So it is developing more and more. Can you talk a little? I know that Jung has the archetype of the wise old man and wise old woman, and I wonder if you could tie it into that elder ideal part, but I wonder if you could speak to that and the relationship of that with dreams in the second half of
Jung. I tell people I'm not a Jungian, I just play one on TV. A joke. Not a Jungian necessarily, but I've certainly learned a lot from Jung. And the thing that I've learned that I think is very important is to pay attention to these second half of life, which Jung certainly did. It's ironic that when Freud began his work, he was really in his 50s, and yet he was very pessimistic about anybody engaging in psychotherapy over the age of 40 or 50. I think unnecessarily pessimistic. And I think, without getting into the quarrel of Jung versus Freud, I think what Jung did was to open up more of attention to this lifespan development element. And we've done a lot in the field of gerontology in recent decades. I'm thinking not just of Robert Butler, who I mentioned before, but of James Beeren, great psychologist who I knew personally, who just died 2 months ago. There was a memorial ceremony for him. He was the founder of the Andrus Gerontology Center out at the University of Southern California. And interestingly enough, Jim was not a Jungian or any kind of depth psychologist at all, but he was a psychologist and an outstanding one of the leaders in the whole world. But the curious thing, I went to his retirement party, actually, when he was 67 or something in the late 1980s, and talked to him about what he was going to do. And what he did in the following 30 years, he died at the age of 97, actually, was to develop what he called guided autobiography. which is a wonderful approach, and people can find out more about that. There's a whole international society on reminiscence and life review that promotes guided autobiography, and it's very closely related to what happens in wisdom circles and what happens in these other arenas, which is people have to look backwards sometimes in order to look forward. Kierkegaard put it this way: we live life forward but understand it backward. And that means we need to draw from our experiences but apply them in a forward-looking way, particularly to future generations. I had the great good fortune, I've been so fortunate in my life to have known some of the really great thinkers and leaders in this field. And one of them was Reb Zalman Schachter, a rabbi who died a year and a half ago. He lived here in Boulder, and he wrote a wonderful book called From Aging to Saging, which really has inspired this wisdom circle idea. And I was in a restaurant with Reb Zalman many years ago, and when he was before he'd written From Aging to Saging, but when he'd gotten interested in this aging work, and he said, this aging business is really very simple. He said, the only question is, are you saved? And I thought, we were sitting around together, I said, well, he's a clergyman. Is this a kind of a theological, he's a rabbi? And he said, no, in a theological sense. I mean it in a computer sense. Are you saved? Have you done? Have you started doing your legacy work? And I think that this is extremely important for people of a certain age, let's say my age and older. They need to be thinking about their legacy work. My friend yesterday, who I had lunch with, the 79-year-old man, he is spending much of his life just working on family history and photo albums and converting films to DVDs and collating his mother's reminiscences about the family. This is very important work for him. This was a man who was a very distinguished professor and intellectual and all of that sort of thing. That no longer has any interest for him. His interest now is, how does he do his legacy work? Well, that's a very particular kind of legacy work. And my dad was like that too, by the way, and he gave me some of those books from our ancestors and all the rest of it. But people do legacy work in different ways. And one of the ways that they do it is in dreams, because in our dreams we sometimes connect with our ancestors. Those voices are in us. We may not be listening, but they're there. And we need to listen more carefully. At the same time, I am very concerned that we have too many cases of elders who just hang around with one another, and I understand why they do it, but we also need to reach out to young people. I recently joined a group called Cyber Seniors, in which I meet up.
Look, I think, are you there, Rick? Are you there, Rick? Hello? I can't hear you, but I'm going to call in on another line to just see if it's my phone or...
Dory, he's still showing on the call, but for whatever reason we can't hear him.
Oh, so what can we do? Is there...
Oh, he just fell off the call now. So.
Okay, maybe he'll come right back on.
Yeah, I can
Hang
try.
in there, everybody.
I'll try emailing him as well as calling him and see if I can do it that way.
That would be great. Hopefully he'll be right back with us. One of the challenges of modern technology.
This is Moody again.
Oh, good. I'm glad you're back. I was hoping you'd discover you were probably talking. So we lost you. I'm trying to think of what was the last thing you said.
I had talked about Reb Zalman. I was talking about cyber seniors and why the elders need to connect to young people, because both can benefit. And I think that we need more of this kind of thing, and educational institutions are ideal places to do this if they can wake up and start paying attention to young and old together. That's my message.
Totally agree. So speak a little more, if you would, about some of the ways dreams illustrate Erikson's, since Erikson's such an important person, of the ego integrity versus despair. Do you find in second half of life that, that people are struggling with that tension?
I do. What I've been talking about so far is actually generativity, which is one of Erickson's ideas. And generativity is something that extends beyond midlife and beyond one's own children or grandchildren. It extends into the widest possible sense, and something I'm very preoccupied with. But at the same time, in later life, we may also be struggling with unresolved issues. And that ego identity versus despair is one that he was very articulate about. I was talking recently to a woman who was nearly 70, and she'd had a long relationship, a good relationship, but it had its problems. And in the dream, she was crying. And people's feelings in dreams are extremely important. And that's, if I were going to give one message, it would be pay attention to the feeling that you have when you wake up from the dream, or in this case, that you actually have in the middle of the dream, because the feelings are really the clue to the meaning of the dream. That's why the business about getting a dream dictionary and so forth is maybe it can be helpful to give you some thoughts that you never had before, but to really get to the heart of the matter for your dream, for you, right now, you need to pay attention to the feelings that you have. If you have them, if you don't, that's okay too. Just write it down and then think about it. And there are different methods that can be used, dream amplification, free association, so forth. We don't need to go into that. But the first step is to pay attention and to listen. And really, that's the most important.
Great. Are there any ways to generalize about dreams of people as they're getting older, or is that...
Yeah, the generalization is that the dreams are going to reflect the stage of life that you're going through. Now, that sounds very trivial to say that, but believe it or not, there is almost nothing, take my word for it, that has been written about dreams and later life. That's why my book, Dreams for the Second Half of Life, is really unusual. People haven't written about this for whatever reason. And I think part of the reason is that many psychologists and psychotherapists have lost interest, even in the psychoanalytic world, have lost interest in dream interpretation. They have other things that they pay attention to. And number two, that we don't pay attention to aging. We need to pay attention because we don't have a shared script or map or way of guiding ourselves in later life, and our dreams can offer that. So all the points that I talk about in my book in terms of midlife transition, retirement, coping with chronic illness, family relationships, bereavement. We haven't talked much about bereavement, but this is a very, very important part of life. As we grow older, all of us, we lose people, and we realize that they really can't be replaced because they have shared our life in significant ways. And that grief work, that's not the same as despair in the sense of personal despair about oneself or relationships, but it is grief at the necessary losses, to use Judith Viorst's phrase, that happen in life. And I think part of our problem as Americans is that we take too seriously the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can pursue happiness, and happiness is certainly possible, but so is grief, and so is loss. And if we love others, then we make ourselves vulnerable, and we have to be open to that. And even if we're not consciously open to it, we will be open to it unconsciously, and our dreams will remind us of our vulnerability and of our losses.
So it's just trying to think of what word to use, but it's like harnessing these things, because our dreams become important resources for us to really be able to have resilience. In fact, it does remind me of that other article that you wrote about the resilience that comes. Maybe you could speak a little more to that, about how, go ahead.
Resilience is the key to everything. Resilience is the key to the body. We have in our body huge reserve capacity. Our kidneys, for example, our lungs, it's called vital capacity, our circulatory system, our brain, okay? Everything in us has this huge, in the brain it's called neuroplasticity, the ability to, it's not infinite. We can't respond favorably to everything. People have strokes, they become paralyzed, they lose capacities, and it is part of life that as we grow older, this is almost a biological definition of aging, our reserve capacity diminishes. We no longer can do the things that we did before, but our reserve capacity is always there. And part of dreaming and part of the nervous system more deeply, dreaming wouldn't occur unless it served some powerful function. While we're asleep and while we're dreaming, REM sleep, we're using more oxygen in metabolism of the brain than we do when we're awake. Why does this happen? How does it happen that all mammals and birds, all warm-blooded creatures, have these periods of dreams? Even porpoises, they dream, but one half of the brain does the dreaming and the other half stays awake. They have a split brain, as we do, because they have to go above water and all the rest of it. There's something very deep here about sleep and dreaming. But the world that we live in, people say, oh, I can get by with 4 hours of sleep, or I don't need much sleep, or people are proud of not sleeping. Why? Because they're proud of being active. They're proud of being productive. They're proud of not aging. Believe me, I know this because I'm one of these people. I know exactly what this pride consists of. It's completely misplaced. What's much more valuable is to say, wait a minute, my body has its own rhythms, its own claims. I need my reserve capacity. I need my sleep. By the way, the best thing you can do for good aging and good health is to get a good night's sleep. And, of course, exercise and have a decent diet and all the rest of it. It's all the things, all the Burmeises that your grandmother told you, they're still true. Hold off on those supplements and pay more attention to getting a good night's sleep. And above all, and this is really the key, and this is Becca Levy and her work at Yale has proven that if you do not have a positive attitude towards your life and towards aging, you may create the very problems that you're so horrified by. And we know this now biologically, that you actually create these losses in us by your very fear of them and hatred of aging. So that's why positive aging is so critical. Positive aging is not denial. It's not saying you can stay young forever, you never grow old, you never have to have arthritis and all. It's not denial. It's looking at what is really positive within our body, within our mind-body system. And dreams are one avenue to this. Just one, but a valuable one.
A really valuable one. And I think what I'm hearing over and thinking about is that the dreams help us really get in touch with kind of the inner wisdom that we have, part of the GPS to guide us through all these transitions. Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. We're given the help that we need.
So we are a little over our time, but I wanted to take a couple minutes for you to tell people a little about, you've mentioned it, but maybe mention more specifically the Positive Aging Conference, your dream workshops. You can say your email again for the Values in Aging newsletter, the things that would be helpful for people to know about. And I can say the Values in Aging newsletter is so helpful because what Rick does is he, in addition to publishing all the conferences, and my programs are on it too, but he also reviews books and films and all kinds of things. So it is wonderful, and it's so wonderful that you do that, Rick, and it's free and a fabulous way.
When I was younger, that I was going to be a great scholar or a big-time intellectual or author or whatever. I realized that that's not the case, but I am a great connector, and that's what I try to do, is to connect people. So anybody who wants to be connected, I'm happy to help connect them. Send me a message at hrmoody@yahoo.com, and I'll send you a sample copy of the newsletter. If you're really interested in dreams, I'm happy to send you an article of mine on dreams and the coming of age, or a little reading list or things like that. You can find out where there are wisdom circles or positive aging groups near you. The National Positive Aging Conference will be in Washington next August 25th to 27th. Certified Senior Advisors is the group that is hosting it and doing the logistics, and our conference will happen just a day before their conference. So anybody who wants to look that up on the web, Certified Senior Advisors, they can get to that site and get all the information about the conference. Still plenty of time to register. I think what makes me very hopeful today is when we first started the National Positive Aging Conference, it's now international because we work with people from all over the world. 8 or 9 years ago, it was just an idea, really, that I had when I was working at AARP, and we found ways to continue that afterwards. Fortunately, Fielding Graduate University, where I'm a visiting professor, has a great program on creative longevity and wisdom. Believe it or not, they have a doctoral program in creative longevity and wisdom, and so they've been a key academic sponsor for this. But I think the message that I would give to our listeners is that you are not alone. There are lots of people in this country and in the world who recognize that age really is a new frontier of new possibilities. And we really need to work together to connect with each other, to open up these positive possibilities. And it's never been more hopeful than it is today.
Absolutely true. I'm going to ask one more question that came from our participants and then be able to move into the final wrap-up, which you've pretty much done, but maybe more. But Bill again from Cambridge says, is it true that by 2050 there will be 3.7 million 100-year-olds? Given that, how would you recommend structuring life reviews, resetting personal and professional dreams to make the most of those extra decades of life?
Well, great question, and I don't have the exact figure, but it's likely to be true. There's only about 50 or 60,000 centenarians today in the U.S. We're likely to have more. On a global basis, yes, we're dealing with global population aging, which is a good thing because it means that we may limit the total human population on Earth. So it's a way of coping with the finitude on our planet. As to what we can do as we move into these future decades, we need to listen to the voices of people who've gone down the road before us. I once had the good fortune to do an interview with a 113-year-old woman who grew up in Montana and told me the story of her life. You don't meet too many people like this. I've only met one. But when we meet people who have reached advanced age, we need to listen to them. I had the good fortune of actually living for 7 years with Larry Morris, who lived in our house, died at the age of 97. I did his oral history. I lived with him day after day, and I learned probably more from him in daily life than I ever learned from any gerontology books. So we need to pay attention. We need to listen, and we need to learn from people who have messages to give us. And I think if we do, we'll be prepared for the year 2050.
Great. And with that in mind, I mentioned this earlier to Rick at the beginning of the call before I started the recording. There's a movie around now. I know it's here. In fact, it's Bill, since you're in Cambridge, is at Kendall Square for the week, and I think it's being shown around the country, so you may want to check. It's called Older Than Ireland. And it's a documentary of about 30 men and women who are 100, and the oldest actually is 113. It's wonderful. I just saw it on Sunday, and it's wonderful hearing, and poignant too, hearing their stories and reflections about life and loss and change and transition. And interestingly, in Ireland, when somebody reaches 100, they get a check for about $2,000.
Really?
Congratulate them. So anyway, I recommend that film, Older Than Ireland. So at this point then, what are any last kind of takeaways for people's thoughts, Rick, that you want to leave the audience with?
My only takeaway is don't be gloomy. Turn off the TV. They specialize in gloom and doom and disasters and fires and muggings and so forth. Listen to yourself and listen to the people who you love and stay connected. And that's really the message. Thank you so much for taking time today to be on this call and to share your wisdom and insights. And thank you. Thank you again, Rick. And as Rick said, email him to become part of that newsletter. I recommend it. And we look forward to your books when they come out. So hopefully they'll be sooner than later. So thanks very much and take care, everybody.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.